Welcome to Breakthrough Barriers with Damali. I'm your host, Damali Peterman. On this podcast, we're looking into a new theme for this season, resilience. How resilience has helped our guests and me get through the pandemic and continue to break through. Welcome to the show. I am so delighted on today's episode to have Jennifer Lupo. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Damali.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. Jennifer Lupo is the managing member of Lupo Law, Arbitration and Mediation PLLC, with offices in Manhattan and Rhinebeck, New York. Ms. Lupo has more than 25 years as a dispute resolution professional. Her unique perspective comes from having sat in every seat at the dispute resolution table as client, advocate, and neutral in both mediations and arbitrations. Jennifer is a member of the National Commercial, Employment, and Consumer Arbitration and Mediation panels of the American Bar Association, the National Commercial and Employment Arbitration and Mediation panels of CPR, and she's a FINRA arbitrator. Ms. Lupo is a neutral with a vast array of experience, having mediated or arbitrated hundreds of cases in the areas of business divorce, complex commercial, employment, entertainment, financial institutions and investments, insurance, intellectual property, labor, municipal liability, civil rights, shareholder member disputes, telecommunications, information technology, and high net worth divorce. Miss Lupo, I'm going to call you Jennifer. You have done everything under the sun when it comes to neutral work. Wow. It's wonderful to have you here today. And I'm just really looking forward to our conversation where we're going to focus on this theme of resilience as it relates to conflict and how you or your company or your industry navigated the last 18 months. The goal is to encourage and inspire our listeners to continue to break through. Now, you and I have a rapport with each other. We've known each other for quite some time. And what I love is our listeners will kind of feel as though they're eavesdropping on a private conversation between two friends. And I knew about you before I actually met you, because anytime I told someone that I was a lawyer and a mediator, the first question was, do you know Jennifer Lupo? And so your reputation preceded you, and you were everything that I thought you were going to be when I met you. Brilliant, so much skill and experience as a mediator, and then just a great advocate for women, for people of color, and also for using ADR in various settings. And so it's just really an honor to have you on our podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Damali. That is a lovely, lovely thing to say. I really enjoy being a neutral, and I enjoy the opportunity to help folks come to their own conclusion about how they want to resolve their matter, because ultimately it's their matter, and they need to be able to take ownership of it and be able to live with the solution that they craft.
I love hearing that, because I think sometimes people think that mediators kind of make decisions for them. And sometimes they just want the arbitrator to just tell them what to do. But what you're saying is that you focus on restoring their sense of agency and really honoring their self-determination and empowering them to kind of think about what's going to be next for them. So what do you want people to know about you, Jennifer? Can you describe yourself in 6 words?
Okay, so 6 words. I would say mediator, arbitrator, mother, friend, professor, and fixer.
Ooh, I like that. So from mediator, arbitrator, professor, mother, fixer, and friend, that really tells us a lot about you. I'd love to know, how did you sort of enter this field? How did you get here?
How did I get into ADR? So in the very first law firm that I worked in, when I was right out of law school, we did a lot of litigation. We did a lot of insurance litigation, and insurance carriers were very keen on using mediation. So from the very beginning, I was at mediation days at these various insurance carriers, and I was learning how to mediate as an advocate on behalf of my client, the insured. And then ultimately, I moved on to go in-house, and I worked for some tech companies. And when I had the opportunity to take a good look at some of the commercial contracts that the company had, I started to look at the dispute resolution and I thought to myself, well, I know what it costs to litigate, and I think that there's a better way to do this. So I started to rewrite our internal contracts to include mediation and then arbitration. When it's your contract or your client's contract, you can do that. But oftentimes I would find myself into somebody else's contract and there would be litigation. So I found myself in what's called the commercial division of the Supreme Court in New York County, oftentimes with cases that were pending. And I would appear in front of a particular judge quite often. And I tended to have the scoundrel defendant. And I would always come with some sort of solution. The judge would not necessarily take my solution, but sometimes he would, sometimes he wouldn't. And ultimately, when there was a call to expand that panel of mediators back in 2005, the judge rang me and said, hey, there's this opportunity. We're asked to identify some attorneys that have come through our parts that might be good mediators for the panel. And I think you would. So I did my first 48 hours of training in 2005. I continue to train till this day, having done my last training in April of 2021. And I have consistently mediated since then.
I love hearing this story. You were doing your job as an advocate, as an attorney, it sounds like, and that a
Yeah.
judge saw, this something in you and recommended you for this program. And that was kind of, all she wrote.
That was it. Really, it is, because when I share that with newer ADR practitioners who say, how am I gonna how do I get established? How do I get to be you? I said, well, first you don't get to be me because there's only room for me to be me. So you have to kind of forge your own path. And I said, I have a unique situation. I became a mediator. I was still litigating at that time. I litigated until 14, but I didn't, the one thing that I did do was that I found a way to balance the two. I found a way to never say no when a case would come to me from the panel. And that opened up opportunity to put myself in front of other attorneys as a neutral, not as, opposing counsel. And from there, my practice as an ADR professional grew. And I got to a point in 12 where I thought to myself, I think I'm tipping, but I'm not quite sure because I wasn't keeping enough statistics in my ADR practice. So I paid attention in 12 and 13. I recognized that I did start to tip, and I said, I'm making a decision. I'm not going to litigate any further after 2014. So I walked out of the courthouse in September of 2014, and I never walked back in as a litigator. I have walked back in as a mediator, but I've never walked in as a litigator since then. And just about the same time in 12, as I saw that I was enjoying mediation, I was approached by Jeff Zano at AAA to consider becoming an arbitrator. And that was something I had never thought of. People over the years had said, hey, you should be a judge. I'm like, why? Why? Why would I do this to myself? And I thought about it, and I did a training. I said, let me see what it has to offer. And I did that training. And then I did small claims arbitration right on the heels of that training. And I said, okay, if you can handle small claims where, folks are not aware of the evidentiary rules, not that you have all of the evidentiary rules at your disposal in arbitration. Nonetheless, like if you can handle this, maybe you should consider arbitration. So then I, moved into arbitration, and the rest is history.
Wow. And so for people who are tuning in who may not know the difference between mediation and arbitration, what's your kind of quick definition or distinguishing point between the two?
Okay, so arbitrators will make the decision, right? So parties you either agree to arbitrate once the dispute arises, or there's a contractual basis that requires arbitration versus litigation meaning going to court. So if you have a contractual or your agreement to arbitrate, you're asking a third party neutral who is a private judge and arbitrator to make the decisions for you. In mediation, you're hiring a neutral to help you come to a conversation, right? Come to the table and have a conversation about hard issues that have caused a dispute between you and someone else. And that neutral is there to help both sides see the best and worst of their positions, find the issues and interests that are very important to them, and then come to a resolution based on those interests that they have. What the distinction between the mediation and arbitration is that in mediation, you can come up with a whole host of resolutions that are not available to you in arbitration or in litigation. And I really love the creativity that I see of people when they're in the mediation room and say, this is an interest that I have, and I really would like to see if I can get X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, well, let's ask, let's see. And I love that.
I agree with you. I do think that there is some benefit to mediation in generating and brainstorming ideas and being really creative and problem solving and joint problem solving. And thank you for providing that distinction because, I feel like sometimes things like mediation, arbitration, people are always wondering, well, what is that? I want to just take people to court, because litigation is so popularized in TV and, wanting to sue is something that people tend to use as a threat often. But I really love hearing you say that this judge introduced the concept of mediation to you and now an opportunity for you to explore arbitration, that you took some courses, you trained, you learned about arbitration, small claims arbitration. And I heard you say earlier too that you continue to learn to this day. I also loved hearing you say that basically in 2012 when you started 2005, I think you said actually.
Five is when I started mediating, and 12 was when I was like, what? I got to pay attention to what's going on over here because I'm like, there's money coming in, but I'm not quite sure. So I had to start running two sets of books to understand what was happening to see if I was tipping. And that's when I started to see, yes, I was starting to tip. And I said, okay, this is real. Let me see what I can do with it because I enjoyed it so much.
And then in September 2014, you walked out of the courtroom as a litigator and you only returned as a neutral after that. And so, wow. So all of that happened before what the world now knows to be coronavirus, like the COVID-19 pandemic. And, I'm assuming that there are always ups and downs happening in the world, but over the past 18 months, I'm assuming that you saw some challenges. And I'd love to know what your single biggest challenge was in sort of running your business or working in your industry, what the single biggest challenge was for you throughout the pandemic.
I think the single biggest challenge is, as a mediator, even to a lesser extent as an arbitrator, is that a lot of what we do is we derive our energy from being in a group setting, right? In the room, in a mediation with all of the parties, their counsel, in separate caucuses, in the arbitration hearing room. There's an energy that comes from being in that communal setting. That energy is not easily replicated using any number of the digital platforms. And that was a very challenging aspect of continuing mediating and arbitrating for me during the pandemic.
And how have you it seems like this new hybrid, at least, of some sessions being in person and some being, remote or continued remote arbitrations and mediations will continue to occur. And so how do you navigate that challenge today?
So one of the things that I did, so when the pandemic hit, I had, lots of work booked for like immediately, right when it was hitting. And it was crickets. right? And no one was responding. Dates would come. I'd say, like, let's adjourn, let's do this, let's do that. I didn't hear any response. About 8 weeks into the pandemic, when I think it became apparent to most folks that business as usual was not coming back at any time soon, then folks started to come back and started to respond to all of those emails from 8 weeks before. And I found myself like really booked over the summer of 20. And one of the things that I did do, because I started to recognize, early on between the, friends wanting to Zoom and family wanting to Zoom and work Zooms and then educational Zooms for how do you deal with, mediating and arbitrating while in a pandemic, there was some Zoom fatigue. So what I did do was I did get past that myself and by saying, this is temporary. It may be a year, it may be 5 years, but it's still temporary. And second, I started to do a lot more pre-mediation work using Zoom. And also pre-arbitration work using Zoom. So I started doing all of my preliminary hearings in arbitration and all my pre-arbitration hearings and all of that on Zoom so that folks can start to connect. We can see each other. We can start connecting with one another. And I think when you see somebody and you're talking to them, it makes people feel a little bit more rest assured. So that is one of the things that I did to kind of get past the inability to be in the room and have that energy. I've also found that, you have to spend sometimes a little bit more time working with folks in this, in virtual hearings and virtual mediations that you would not normally have to if you were in person. But that's okay. That's part of adapting to whatever the given situation is. And you adapt. Either you adapt or you die, right? So I adapted.
Well, I love that you said that either you adapt or you die, and you are still here. You are still standing. So, Jennifer, where does your resilience come from, and how do you tap into it?
It's funny. I was thinking about it when you had asked me to be on the podcast, and I saw that the theme was resilience, and I've been thinking about resilience, right? And I think where my resilience comes from is I had a really great example of resilience in the form of my mom. So my mom, my mom and dad, and I'll share this. My mom and dad split when I was 3. And then when I was 10, my mother moved me to a suburb of New York City that was inhospitable for somebody like me and somebody like her. Nonetheless, we were there, and she decided to go back to school and retrain to be a social worker, and she did. And we had to sort of figure ways to work around the inhospitability of our suburb. And we did, and we prevailed, and I prevailed, and it gave me opportunities to learn about different people and different things that you didn't really know at 10, that that's really what was happening. But now at my age, I'm able to look back and say, gee, that was a tough time in life. And nonetheless, I persevered. I was able to get past it. I was able to learn from it. I was able to grow. So whenever some sort of adversity has hit, I say to myself, okay, this is happening. First, you get to have your pity party for, 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And then now you have to move on and have to find a way to move past and move through. And it really is through. Most of the time, for people say you try to work around, you're going through it. You're just walking through it. And it's like, and I describe this last 18 months as walking through molasses, like, swimming in molasses, because there was no good information at any given moment in time about the state of this horrendous public health pandemic. The information was coming at different times from different places. It was, sometimes it was contradictory. Same place gives you different information, within a few weeks. And I started to think about that, and I said, well, it's like we're building the boat, and we're also out to sea. So of course, the information has to change, and I have to be able to adapt to it. So that's basically my resilience comes from, my mom and from the years of being in an inhospitable suburb.
Oh, and I'm sure you learned some things that'll help you navigate any storm, whether it's a surprise pandemic or, challenges of moving from an in-person service to, this new hybrid or virtual for a long time. And I loved hearing you say that you figured out how to navigate that by, more preparation up front and starting to use the technology and introduce it earlier, to kind of help that be the connection of the thread as you were continuing to have hearings, et cetera. And so, what is interesting is you talked about tapping into the resilience, because you had a role model, your mom, who, you saw be very resilient, and also living in a situation that was inhospitable, and kind of looking back and taking away the lessons from that experience. What other lessons can you share with us today? And specifically, I'm just thinking about, and the word mistake can sometimes be triggering, but just, what sort of mistake did you make, if any, that you would like to prevent others from making?
So the greatest mistake I can tell you that I made, and this comes from early on as being both a lawyer and being a mediator, is thinking that you can do this, you can treat each matter the same way, right? You can't, because each matter comes with different human beings. And each one of those human beings comes with whatever their life experience is. And that has so much to bear on how, whatever it is, whether it's a mediation, it's litigation, whatever the case, an arbitration, or just your general interaction with folks in your life, you have to meet people where they are, and you have to be flexible. So that inflexibility that I had very early on in my career, I'm so thankful now that I've evolved and say, okay, this is happening. Okay, so you don't want to do opening statements. Okay. All right, so we won't do opening statements. All right, okay. You want to go straight to caucus. You don't want to give your client an opportunity to tell me all of their unhappiness about what has happened. Okay. All right, so your client doesn't want to settle now because they haven't had their opportunity to tell me their unhappiness. Well, maybe we should let them tell me their unhappiness now, right? But letting things just, organically, I know that word is overused, but organically evolve and not be as rigid. That is the one takeaway from if I can give anything to the listener, is to be as flexible and as athletic as you can. And it doesn't matter if you're a mediator, an arbitrator, just in life. You got to take people that you meet along the way, from where they are, and recognize that they're carrying, some water themselves, and that you have to work with that.
That is deep, Jennifer. And I love how you're introducing transferable skills, right? Not just to the ADR profession, but from anyone listening from whatever industry they occupy, or whether they're thinking about pivoting, just to kind of think about meeting people where they are and recognizing that they're three-dimensional, that person's three-dimensional, and that I like how you put it, that they may be carrying some water too, right? So that there's more than meets the eye. One of the ways that I like to end, and it's apropos, I believe, because you mentioned getting resilience from your mom. My mom is definitely a source of my resilience as well, and she used to always say, "Each one teach one." And so I love to end our podcast by just thinking about a suggestion of a book, a song, a course, a program, or something, for our listeners to kind of take away as homework to do following the podcast.
So I have two. One is I did a master class during, no, it wasn't a master class. I think I did it through Coursera. At the very beginning of the pandemic, I did it with my brother and his wife, and my husband and I did it. We did The Science of Happiness from Yale. I think that is a very useful class for many people. It dispels the thoughts of this need to be happy all day, every day, and really teaches you how to look at yourself and see what makes you happy, what doesn't make you happy, and how to kind of get to spending more time with those things that make you happy. And then the other thing I would suggest is a movie. I just watched it recently. The movie is Worth, and it is the story of Ken Feinberg, who was the special master for the 9/11 Victims Fund. And it really shows his transformation about how he looked at, hacking up a finite amount of money and trying to parse it out to all of these victims, and how he had to transform and take a look at himself and recognize that these people are actually people and they're not all the same. And I thought that was a very interesting movie, and it was interesting to watch how that transformation occurred.
Thank you so much. I think those are both great takeaways. And you've just given us so many jewels today in terms of source of your resilience, and so in terms of how to meet a big challenge over the course of the pandemic. And just also, I mean, something that you said that I think should also resonate is just being open, because you walked in the courtroom as a litigator not knowing that at some point in the future, a judge who saw you many times would see something in you and introduce, you to other dispute resolution mechanisms in addition to litigation. And so I love that you
Absolutely.
were open and able to receive that message. I just want to thank you so much for being here today, Jennifer. You're an extraordinary, extraordinary guest.
Thank you. It was lovely to be here and lovely to see you today.
Oh, likewise. And I'd like to also thank our audience for tuning in. I'm your host, Damali Peterman, and this is Breakthrough Barriers with Damali. Continue to break through and have a wonderful day.
Please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Breakthrough ADR. That's the @ BREAKTHROUGH, capital A, capital D, capital R. I'm your host, Damali Peterman, and this is Breakthrough Barriers with Damali. Although I am a lawyer, mediator, and an educator, and many of my co-hosts will represent various professions, we want to be clear that we are not providing legal advice, counseling, or suggestions. Our goal is to provide a roadmap for conflict resolution to generate future conflict resolvers. Continue to break through and have a wonderful day.